welcome to a brand new painting lesson, our first painting of 2020, and I am really excited about this one. We are working on a 24 by 36 inch canvas, and we are starting the year off with something really special. If you have ever felt like you struggled with clouds or rocks, I really think after this lesson you'll have a good handle on each of them and you'll feel really confident going into the new year with both of those. So with that said, again, welcome to 2020. Thank you for being here, for supporting the channel up here on Patreon. I think it is absolutely amazing that I get to start the year working on such a big piece. And, you know, teaching art for a living, that's a pretty amazing thing that you provide me with the opportunity to do, and I really hope you enjoy this. I know that I personally learned a lot actually painting this guy, and you'll find that through the lesson. There are a couple instances where I get a little animated, a little excited, and it's because I found this new thing that we get to try and incorporate, and I had so much fun, and I really hope you do too. But as per usual, if you have any questions, let me know. You can leave a comment, you can send me a direct message. This, I've actually decided, is going to be a Patreon exclusive series. So we're going to work on this painting throughout the month because it is just so large, and we're going to take our time. We're going to focus on each subject, make sure we get it right, and talk about all of the different little techniques that we can incorporate along the way. So this is just for you. This is a thank you for supporting the channel, for ensuring that, you know, we get to do things like this. I think it is so special. So thank you for being here. Thank you for making this happen. I hope you have a fantastic experience, and yeah, I'll stop talking and we'll get right into the lesson. So, as you can see, we have a very large canvas here. It is 24 by 36 inches, and we're going to begin with quite a large brush as well. It is 3 inches wide here, and it does have a sharp edge, so if we need to work around the edges of the mountains, we'll be able to do so fairly simply. It's also worth noting that I have taped my reference photo here to the canvas down below the sky so I can test colors directly on it and make sure that we're on the right track. With that said, let's get into the paints. So here we have our palette, and I have some titanium white, cerulean blue, and Mars black. That's really all we're going to need for the sky and these initial colors. And I'm going to start here by taking the corner of my brush, grabbing quite a bit of titanium white. I'll grab about maybe a fifth of that of cerulean blue, and then maybe 1/10 of that in Mars black. And we'll just start mixing this up, initially with the corners, and then with the full body of the brush. That way we get something nice and consistent. So I'm actually not starting with a lot of pigment here. I want it to be relatively minimal so I can kind of test things, make sure that my colors are what I want them to be, and I can already tell that it's not quite bright enough. So I'm going to interject some extra titanium white into that. We'll mix again. We'll test again. And that is looking much, much better, but I think I'll make it slightly brighter one more time. It's a friendly reminder not to just go with the first color you come up with. Do test, do play with things. Okay, so I like that a lot. It's not exactly what we have in the reference photo. It's okay to deviate a little bit, but I know that I personally I'm a big fan. I think that it's going to give us a lot of range. I wanted something quite bright at the bottom so that when we moved up to the darker on the top, we'd have a lot going on. Now you'll notice that I'm actually painting predominantly with the corners of the brush here, at least initially, along the edges of these mountains. And that's because when you have fresh paint on your brush, you're going to be able to render the sharpest line, so that's why I'm starting kind of in those edges. And then I move out once I feel like I just won't have that much control with the pigment. You'll also see little bits of blue and white and all of those individual pigments that we use in our mixture, kind of scattered about here. And so I'm just going to go back over those areas fairly lightly, blend them out, That just occurs because we have a little bit of unmixed paint on our brush. Generally something you want to avoid, but it's easy to fix and work out. Once I have a lot of it applied, I'm kind of going over a larger portion very softly, and it's just giving me a more consistent look. I'm then going to go back, I'm going to add another layer of paint. You might want to wait for it to dry, but acrylics are fairly thin, and so you're going to find that you're going to go off and redo areas numerous times. There we go. I'm also going over some of my edges from the clouds there. Not an issue at all. We can always redraw these things in, and it's much better to go slightly over your other drawn subjects than just forget to do the edging. And that's because it's much easier to redraw in and paint on top than it is to go back and remix colors and kind of fill in that gap. So here I'm remixing my paint. This time I did opt for something slightly brighter, only slightly. And here yet again we are just progressing upwards. And soon we're going to have to adjust this pigment to be somewhat darker. That way we can create our gradient. But this is a nice easy way of just getting into the painting, getting used to working with that brush, mixing that pigment. And I always advocate starting your paintings with an easier portion, with a larger area, with a consistent mix, just because it's going to start you off in a good headspace. It's going to let you get comfortable, warmed up, and that's essentially just what we're doing here. So, we have blue. Now, let's continue. So I'm going to take some extra blue here. I'm going to take about maybe a fifth of that in Mars Black. I continuously take off the extra right there on the palette. We're just mixing up a slightly darker variant of the pigments we currently have. I'm also mixing on my palette, not just up and down, but also left and right, just in case there is little bits from the edges that are of different colors, and that will add that almost splotchy effect that we initially had, because not everything was blended fully. Which again, it's easy to remedy, but it's better if we just don't have to remedy it. So I'm applying this slightly on top of that blue, then I'm starting to work it down, looking for those soft blends. I'm not applying much pressure with my brush because the more pressure you add, the more streaky it will get. If you find that you just don't have enough pigment to cover these areas, then I just simply advise going back to your palette, mixing more pigment, and then recovering that area. It's a much more efficient way of going about it. Now you can see that I'm frequently remixing on top of the same area, and I'm doing that because I can just look to the side and see how close it is to the original mix, right? So it's just setting me up at a good starting point. And you can even mix into that previous pigment and give yourself a bit of a head start. So I do want to progressively make this darker, which as you can see I am doing. If you look there versus there. And this lesson, these mixes, these pigments, all of it will get, again, significantly more detailed, and the mixes will be more complicated, but starting simply, confidently, putting yourself in a good position to succeed is a great thing to do. So you also notice that as I'm working around these edges, I am sometimes moving my brush on an angle, right, while I'm cutting in. But then I do go back to that horizontal stroke. I make it consistent, I blend it out, I go over areas multiple times with very minimal amounts of pressure. And we need to blend these two together. Now I am finding that this is starting to dry. So I'm not getting that clean, wet into wet blend that I initially was, but that's okay. I didn't expect to. At a certain point with acrylics, especially when working on large areas, you're going to have to paint wet into dry and do a bit of a blend like that. And that's okay. With that, we're going to get darker yet again. Going to get quite a bit darker this time. I'm going to make sure it's quite gray as well. That's why we're interjecting the white and the black in conjunction with the blue, which would have in itself been darker. But by working in all of the white and black, you desaturate it a little bit. You get something that's a lot more natural. Generally, you don't have these hyper vibrant colors in the sky. And so gray is pretty important. And I think when a lot of people are just starting painting and kind of just beginning, we tend to gravitate towards those hyper-saturated, incredibly vibrant mixtures that are eye-popping and are fun, but do lean away from realism. And that's okay. You can take artistic liberties. You can make your paintings how you like to make them. But I always do advocate the idea of, learning how to do it with a bit more of a realistic look initially, and then breaking those rules as you want to. But give yourself the lessons, the opportunities, the techniques, the information, so that you can decide what rules you want to make and you never feel limited by the techniques that you currently have. So here you can see we applied that darker pigment, and now we're going to blend. I'm dragging it down. I generally like to move in X shapes because I get a lot of a consistent movement. And you can see we're bringing that light pigment up here, we're bringing that dark pigment down here. It's a little bit messy right now, but when we go to the edge, we apply very minimal amounts of pressure, we go back and forth a few times. We kind of start losing that area there, but that's fine. And we very quickly end up getting something that's much more soft and gradient-like. You might get a little bit of a visible line, but you can continuously rework it. And again, this is acrylic, so we're going to have to go back in and do additional layers. So for a first layer here, this is actually looking quite nice. I'll also get some Mars Black, titanium white, maybe a little bit more Mars Black, maybe a little bit more Cerulean blue. I said titanium white. I did mean Cerulean blue. There we go. Let's mix that up. Progressively make this darker. You can even make it a little bit more rich as you get up here towards the top. So you can start interjecting slightly more blue, slightly more saturation. But on that horizon, especially in a scene like this, you're going to have a lot of light. That light is white. White naturally desaturates pigments, and therefore when your subjects, when your sky, when your atmosphere, when really anything is closer to light, it's going to get a little bit more void of saturation. And that's okay. That range is going to make things pop, that difference. So with that said, yet again, we went a little bit darker. Headed up to the top here. And now we're just working that back in. And left and right. Now we do have a bit of an edge, so what do? Working a bit of a crisscross. Now I generally like to use a little bit of water on my brush, make things damp, extend the wet life of my paint so it doesn't dry so quickly, and you can do that if you find you're struggling, but I decided not to do that here because it does thin your pigment, and I wanted a nice, fairly thick base layer for what we're doing right here in the sky. But that's a great start. Now, I wanted to get a little closer and simply note that when we really look at this and our first layer, despite the fact that we didn't use water or thin our paint in any way, you can still see portions of the drawing, the grid, underneath this first layer of paint, and that's because, again, acrylics are naturally quite thin, and acrylics will look significantly better the more layers you apply. So this was a first layer, and I like it a lot. I feel like we got our values in there. I feel like we have a nice gradient. We chose great colors. We tested, we made sure they were right, but it's not finished because, again, it's a little bit too thin. You still have a bit of that white from the canvas even showing through. So what we're going to do, we're going to let this dry completely. Then I'm going to go back. I'm just going to do a second layer in the exact same way, make sure that it's nice and thick. And then from there, we can progress in the painting. And this is just friendly reminder, do add more paint. If you're not super happy with it initially, then the second layer will probably get you there, and the third layer, you know what, that can always help too. So just do it a couple times. Again, it's great practice, it's a great way of getting into it, and just so we don't spend, 20, 25 minutes in this top gradient, again, I'm just going to do the next layer myself, and then we'll hop into the next part of this together. So now we're heading over to the right-hand side of the canvas here. I'm going to take that same brush, which, as you can see, I did clean off just to make sure that we don't have a lot of dark or diluted pigment on it, especially when we're working down here in this lighter area. So I'm going to begin, yet again, by taking some titanium white, and I'm going to do this farther away from this. At this point, we have a lot of Mars Black in there. It's quite diluted, it's very dark, and at this point it would be quite difficult to get very bright yet again. So I'm going to essentially start again with those brighter mixtures over here on the palette. And as you can see, I do use the corners, make sure that I get all of that white, black, and blue paint off and get it nice and consistent. Down there, I can test it over on the other side of my canvas. I can test it on my reference photo. And then once I have it the way I like, which I actually do, I can start using that corner of the brush, just as we did before, to block in around our mountains, like so. I am going slightly over the edges of all of my drawings here, because again, it is much easier to paint atop this blue, redraw it in, than it would be to remix this color later and then just kind of do all of these edges. It's much more efficient this way. So as you can see, we're just working that edge, and there we go. So now we can go back, grab more pigment, ground the canvas a little bit better so it doesn't have too much of a wobble. That is kind of an interesting point of painting on such a large piece. Put a lot of pressure on one side and it's going to make a difference. Now I'm softening things left and right, though I can tell that the paint is a little bit thin, and that was really just to be expected, and a second layer will fix that. So yet again, I'm not really at the point where I want to darken it much at this point. Maybe a hint, but really not much. Now I'm going to have a orange, rather a very desaturated orange, maybe to the point of looking a little purple cloud right here. So I'm going to go over that quite a bit because that is something that's going to be a bit more thin cloud-wise. We're going to have clouds that are quite thick and have large bodies. We're going to have some that are thin, transparent, perhaps a little more wispy. And it's that diversity of cloud type that'll make them interesting and the piece continuously engaging and evolving. So, just filling that in. Now, we've gotten rather high, so we can start grabbing a hint of Mars Black, Cerulean Blue. We can work these two in here, and if we accidentally make it too dark, don't worry about it. We can always walk it back by throwing in some extra titanium white. Now, continuing the side here and that same process that we just used on the other side, it's something that I used to be hesitant on including in these lessons because I didn't want things to get kind of stagnant information-wise. I didn't want people to get bored and feel like they weren't continuously learning throughout the lesson. However, I think that the longer I've taught painting, the more I've come to realize just how valuable repetition is. And I've noticed when I still watch different lessons or pick up different ideas, I like to watch them a couple of times. I like to continuously get fed that information so that it's something that I do retain and it's not kind of something I pick up today and then I forget tomorrow. So while I will be cutting out portions here and there, maybe just adding that second layer, things like that, I do want to occasionally go over these techniques again, just to make sure that it is something that really sticks. I think that when we do this, there are also possibilities of me mixing the wrong color or doing something that I didn't the first time that should be noted on. Maybe there's a fix we can make, different things of that nature. I'm not one to shy away from trying different things and making mistakes in the lessons. I think that that's a great way of learning. I think you can pick up a lot from it. And I think it's also important to note that it does happen to everyone. And while it may happen, you can still have a lot of confidence in the end piece, in the vision, the goal, and just continue to work towards that. With that said, here again, we are progressively making things get a little bit darker. Working with a slightly larger palette here than I normally do, so it keeps kind of scraping the edge of the canvas. Do need to watch out for that. Don't want to accidentally put a scratch in it. I do feel like that's a little bit too gray. I think it needs to be more rich. We talked about that on the other side, so I am working in some extra Mars Black, quite a bit of Cerulean Blue. I'll mix that up. I'll test it down on my reference. Okay, that is much more saturated. Good. So here you can see that it actually fits so much better in that transition, and we're not actually getting that pure saturated pigment that we just had on our palette because of course it mixed with the gray we just applied to the actual canvas. So it's really an amalgamation of colors, but that's not a bad thing. Here we're just going back, fixing that up. Now we move higher, we'll make it slightly darker, we'll make it slightly more blue. If we just added the Mars Black would mix with the titanium white in the mixture and it would make it more gray yet again. So we need to continuously add back in that blue to ensure that that saturation level is something that stays where the rest of the painting is at. That said, again, it can progressively get slightly more saturated as we move up from that light source down here. So this is quite stark in relation to that last blue. You can see quite a hard edge. Not a big deal. Watch this. We work in our X-shaped pattern. I say, you know what, I'm not worried about that or that. I know where those lines are. I know I can redraw it. You can go back to the start of the video, see where it is. You can use the traceable if you're up over on Patreon or the reference photo. A bunch of different ways to kind of figure that out again. So we're just going to go over it, left and right, very soft, until we get it nice and soft. With that, I am now going to go ahead and work in this area right here while I let that dry. Then once it's dry, we'll head back and we'll add a second layer of paint to kind of this entire side as we did the left-hand one. Now, before we continue, I would like to note that if you look at our brush, you'll see these little heads that are starting to form. And this essentially occurs when the brush is fairly damp, it starts to dry, and on it has this acrylic paint which is starting to dry around different little clusters. So it's holding each of these together, and this is actually going to have an effect on the canvas because it'll render small little streaks. So what you can do about this is simply go and wash your brush again, continuously keep it very slightly damp. I don't want it to be wet because then again it'll really thin the paint, but just ensuring that it doesn't look like this when you're trying to render a bit more of a smooth look and aesthetic is something to keep in the back of your head. So I'm going to go clean that, then we will get on to that next part. Also, here's a little example of what's happening, and you can see just a couple of those right there. I was able to soften them fairly well, and I'm not too worried about it because, again, this is the first layer, but in the second layer, that is something I really would want to avoid. So when we're going into this, I would heavily recommend looking at the pigments to the left, looking at the pigments to the right, and just ensuring that the values and the saturations are going to match up. This is also something you could do while you're doing that way you know that it's absolutely perfect, but I do think that it's a good lesson in color mixing to really not. So here, we are just going to attempt to remix that middle pigment. The one that I had on my palette was, of course, from the top, so it was a bit too dark, and so I'm going to try to find my way back to something a little bit lighter. And it's also worth noting that the pigments that I did have here on my palette are now fully dry, so it's not something I need to worry about, and I'm just simply working on top of that area of the palette. So once we get that nice and consistent, I can test on one side, kind of figure out where it lines up. Looks like it's right about there. And I know that everything under this needs to be brighter. I know everything above it needs to be darker. And we'll just blend that out. We'll grab some extra titanium white. Work that right down here. And in a little bit. Definitely too bright at this point, so we'll blend that more so into that previous mixture, and we'll give it a try. Again, don't go with the first pigment you end up with on your palette. Keep trying, make things diverse, get better with them. We'll add just the smallest amount of titanium white into that as we get lower. Work it out multiple directions. And here you can see that I'm actually working vertically. And now I'll switch to horizontal and just blend that out a little bit. The first one will look a little bit more streaky because, again, we are working on our first layer. We'll see the canvas through it. We'll see a bit more of the actual pigment. It's not something to worry about. With that said, once we have this applied, I'm actually going to go ahead and work on this because it's now dry. Apply those second layers and just make sure that everything's how we want it. But yet again, here we have a nice gradient, and here we're blending it out. So once you've painted in both sides and that little area, I would definitely advise taking some steps back and looking at the canvas with a bit of a wider view and just ensuring that this side does connect into that side and then into there, and that you don't have this darker area kind of come down to here on this side and then maybe down to here on this side. You can have a bit of a movement that is dynamic that will look quite good, but you don't want it to essentially look straight and then have this middle ambiguous area kind of have to allude to the fact that it's almost like stairs, right? So just something to look out for, and if it doesn't look quite right, you know what, that's okay. Doing another layer will probably make the painting even better. We do learn with every layer we apply, but with that said, it is time to go ahead and start layering in the base layer for our clouds, which are really just about everywhere. But before we apply any actual paint to the canvas, I'm going to do a little bit of color testing first. So now I thought I'd show you how I personally figure out which colors I'm going to be incorporating in the painting. So yet again, here we do have that reference photo up. I have painted a little bit on it here and there just to kind of test things before we actually started the lesson. But with that said, I do have a smaller brush. This is just a round pointed brush. It's about 1/8 of an inch, but that doesn't really matter for this. We're just using it to mix a little bit of paint on the palette and test it right up here. So what we're going to do to build up these clouds is start on the darkest pigment, and that is going to be this seemingly purple. It's probably a very desaturated orange. They can look quite similar, especially in skies. But I'm going to start with that, and then we'll slowly start adding on these highlights and build it up to create volume. But that means initially we need to cover all of this with that purplish desaturated orange. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my brush here, and I'm going to grab some of our primary red, which I've added to our palette. I'm also going to grab a hint of our cerulean blue, and I'm going to initially do about half and half. And as you can see, we have a purple already there, and I look at that and I say that's purple. So will this work? Well, let's test it. Definitely not. That does not work at all. So now let's take some titanium white, take off the excess, and we'll work that in. Why am I adding titanium white? Because that was too dark. So now it's brighter. Let's test it. Oh, you know what? It's closer, but it's not what we want. It's still now a little bit too bright, maybe a little bit saturated. So I'll add a hint of Mars Black. Not much Mars Black. It's a very strong pigment. You won't need much of it. Now we'll test yet again. Oh, look at that. We are even closer, but still a little bright, a little saturated. By adding more Mars Black, we'll darken it yet again, but we'll also desaturate it because it's slowly mixing with the titanium white that we initially had, and that's making it more and more gray. If we wanted it to be more saturated again, we would need to re-interject some extra blue and red. Now, I did make it a little bit too dark, so here I'm walking it back. And oh, that is by far the closest that we've had thus far. Let's test it in a different area just because this is starting to get a little busy. Let's go up here. You can see that these are all brighter than it. Still brighter. You can see I'm bouncing around. Up here, that's exactly what we need for the top. So we know that this color is a check mark for that. So I might even write a little T there, just so I know that's for the top. Now I'll take a little bit of this because I know this color is very close to what we want. I'll get some titanium white, I'll brighten it. And that looks just about perfect for a lot of this, especially along those edges. It'll probably be too dark for down here. Maybe a hint too dark, but this will be great for a base. We can slowly adjust it to be brighter in some areas, darker in others, and look at that. So I do think this is something that you could go with a very desaturated orange with. You could go with a pure purple. This is going to be slightly more saturated, it's slightly different, but I think it's close enough that we're going to get a very similar effect. And if anything, it's just going to be heightened a little bit. So that's essentially how I go about figuring out my colors. And with that said, we now have our mixes, so we can work with those to create just significantly greater amounts. And it's also worth noting that the body of the cloud, the area that is closest to the center of all of these clusters, is going to be the darker variant, much like up here. And then as you move towards the edges, it's going to get a lot brighter because more light can pass through it. It's more transparent. You can see the light from the sky behind it. So in the most dense areas of the clouds, that's where we start with that. And then on the edges, maybe we work there. Of course, that middle area and even some of the edges will get a lot of paint added on a little bit later. With that said, let's get back to painting. So now what we're going to do, we're going to add quite a bit of our primary red to our palette here, quite a bit of our cerulean blue, and we're going to mix up that purple that we were working with before that just looked so close to what we had in our photo. So I know that I need to start here initially with a regular purple, and I have the initial mixture just right up there to reference off of. I'm going to try really hard not to go over that fully, and I know that I also need quite a bit of titanium white in there as well. So we're just mixing this all up. At this point it definitely does look too dark, and if I do accidentally go over my initial mix, that is okay. We can just go back to the photo and give that a try. You also don't need to match on the reference photo. I know that not everybody is up over on Patreon, and it isn't a necessity. It's just something I personally like. And you know, if you're out and you see a landscape or a scene that you're really inspired by, you can take a picture, you can print that out, and you can ensure that it matches that day, that scene, that memory as best you can. So with that, I think this is actually quite close. So I think, you know what, it might be a little bit darker, a little bit more desaturated. I just tested it on the photo. So we will mix that up. So with that said, here yet again we are back to using that very large 3-inch brush. It isn't what we're going to be using for the entirety of the painting, but it is great for the sky and blocking in larger areas like this. Now, as you can see, I kind of started in the middle here. I'm not worried about sharp edges, so that's not something I need to cut in first. And what I'm not doing is I'm not taking this, applying a lot of pressure, and then dragging down here where you get this very chalky look that's simply not going to do much for you. Instead, I'm kind of working out from this middle area. I go back to my palette, I grab more paint, and I try to consistently build a nice thick base layer. Much like the sky, you'll probably want to go ahead and do multiple layers, but you still want this first one to be good. With that said, I've just about used up all of the wet paint on my palette, so we'll mix more. Get that red, get that blue, probably need a bit more red after that. Some Mars black, titanium white, and we'll mix these together. A bit of a less messy way of going ahead and mixing this is actually by using a palette knife. That way you don't get all of this pigment kind of working its way up the brush and creating little splotches of other colors. It's definitely an option. It's not something you have to do, but it's certainly an idea. If I wasn't teaching the lesson and holding the palette, it's probably something I would personally be doing actually. So here you can see I have that initial color right there at the top. I'm just mixing towards it right now. I think it's a little too purple and maybe a little too blue, so I'm adding in some extra red. Bring it more towards the pink. I think it's also a little bit more desaturated in our initial application. So I'm going to add in some white, which will probably brighten it to be brighter than what I actually want it to be. But now I can add some Mars black. That white and black will mix to a gray, and it looks like we found our way back to that initial color. So now, yet again, I'm going in fairly thick applications. I am going over that initial area as well. Just checking my photo, making sure I'm moving in the right direction. My easel does have a little bit of a lip that comes down, and it will stop me from painting on about 2 millimeters down and a number of inches wide, but that's fine. I'm fairly accustomed to that, and it's something I just kind of go back in and paint in and fix once I'm done the rest of the painting. It's kind of cathartic to do all of this big work, then you know, really do all of the detail work, and then at the end just have this little spot where it's like, okay, we can really relax and just have fun with it. You can see that I'm trying to keep this fairly consistent as well. It's not something that's hyper streaky. You'll also notice that at this point I am avoiding the edges for the most part. That is something we will go in and do with a different brush in a little bit. It's also okay if this dries, so don't worry about kind of doing this really quickly to kind of catch up so you can do the edges. It won't have a negative effect at all. Okay, so now we're moving down here. You can see that I'm not working purely with horizontal strokes, but that we can soften them. We do need to be a bit more careful with how we soften them now though, because we can't just go left and right. If we do, we'll end up over the blue. So that was kind of something we had an opportunity to do initially that we no longer will, but that's okay. So now we're moving over here to the left-hand side of the painting, and I'd like to note that I'm actually not going to do this area right here with this brush, because this is going to be saved for just these much larger areas, and anything like this is probably going to be a bit more wispy. You're going to want more transparent edges. You're not going to want this kind of very thick imposing base layer. So we are going to be cognizant of which clouds we are painting over with this and which ones we are not, because it is going to make a difference. And again, I like to do this with the biggest ones. I like to do this with the ones that I know are going to be fully opaque. The edges, again, I'm not doing right now because portions of them aren't going to be. So I might clip the edge a little bit here and there, but it's not going to be anything substantial. Also, you can see all of this granular tooth-like effect in the actual canvas right now, and that's just because, again, I'm not worried about that edge. I'm just trying to get the base in. Here I am going over an area for a bit of a blend, going left to right, doing that horizontal thing I do, very light strokes. As I go over this, you can see that there isn't even a mark really on it, but I'm still avoiding going over this because that's a little bit risky. So this area, I think, is just about done. We can head over to the right-hand side. Now, something I like to talk about really in all of my lessons is the fact that acrylic paintings are innately thin, they need a lot of layering, and because of that, you're going to end up, inevitably, with some not-so-aesthetic layers. You may also end up with a little bit of background drilling in your video. Oh, there it is again. If it persists, I will take a break and then we'll come back to it in a minute. But essentially, you're going to want to accept that there are going to be points in the painting that just aren't going to look that aesthetic, and that's okay. That is part of the process, and it's really not anything to worry about. You just need to kind of have faith in the final vision and the fact that in the end we'll build it up to get something that's really nice. But most, even great painters, don't love their pieces until that final 10-15% of the painting. You know, you finish 80-90% and then it starts to look good, and then it starts to come together. And that's just kind of the nature of the medium. And that's not a bad thing. I think it builds a lot of self-confidence in the fact that, you know, you have to see your vision through to really experience what you want. It's not something that's, at least visually, entirely rewarding throughout the entirety of the process. It is in that, you know, you get little areas, it's like, oh look, I was able to mix that color, oh look, I was able to do that application, that texture, and that's definitely a rewarding feeling, but there is definitely a big element of recognizing that you need to work through things. Put in the time. Again, great for character. I realized that this cloud is actually going to be a lot larger, so I am building that up here. I think I'll build that out over here. I'm just kind of reestablishing the shape we kind of lost while we were incorporating the sky. And I'm being a bit more loose with this. You don't have to be. Again, you can go back to the start of the video, look at the drawing. If you're on Patreon, use the traceable, the reference photo, all of that, it's options. Nice to have options. Here you can see I'm also just figuring out where those clouds are going to be. I'm not afraid of being loose. I'm not afraid of trying different things, as long as I feel that they can be expanded upon in such a way that it's going to look aesthetic. So I always try to make things slightly smaller than what I think they're going to be, because it's much easier to expand than it is to retract. subjects like this that are layered on top of previous subjects like the sky. So that's something I am thinking about in this process, but I know that in the end this cloud is going to be a bit larger, so I am having this area protrude right here and then maybe come back a little bit. And then the same with this area. It's kind of coming up and it's getting this really neat wispy motion. Now, once I start to finish up with those general areas, I'm going to move over here. And as you remember with the reference photo, it was actually much darker in that top right-hand corner. So I'm going to remix, but I'm going to do so a little bit down. That way I can kind of save this pigment for the edges, and that way I know what I'm mixing into. But down here, I'm going to make a slightly darker version of that color. So as you can see, it is getting there. It's a little bit too saturated right now, and I think it's still a little bright, so I am working in some extra Mars black there with the corner of my brush. And just like that, we have a darker pigment, and its saturation level looks quite similar. So let's apply that to the top and start blending. So I'm going to try to make sure that it's not just on the corner of my brush, but it's on all of my brush. And because we're working on a corner, the canvas is going to get a little bit wobbly, so we're going to use slightly less pressure, which is actually a good thing and a good reminder because, again, the more pressure you apply, the more streaky your applications are going to get, and you can accidentally make your layers a little bit too thin because when you do apply that pressure, you do move that paint around a lot more, and you might not leave enough in the areas in which you want it. So I'm going over a couple of areas yet again. Here, we'll work right around that edge, but won't get too close. So as you can see here, we are going back up. We are making this corner a bit darker, and we are, of course, mixing these colors on our palette rather than on our canvas. You can go on the canvas, but you'll just consistently get things more accurately by working here. And if you end up with a color that's quite off, it won't be a lot to kind of work around and get back to the way it was, right? So now when we step back, it admittedly does look a little messy, but this is actually exactly what we want at this point. We wanted a flat layer, essentially, of a fairly thick, very desaturated, but relatively dark purple. And if you look at the movements that are happening here in the cloud, it's all very abstract. It's very flowing, and no portion of it looks similar to another portion. So it's continuously diverse, and the idea behind that is that when someone new is coming to look at your painting, they see all of these different movements and they don't feel like they've looked at this part and then they automatically understand this part and this part and that part. They're all different. So it's all something to continuously explore, and it's not something where you can kind of glance at and then feel as if you've taken it in. So as an artist, it's important to remember to keep the piece moving and diverse even when you have a lot of a single subject. With that said, we are now going to switch our brush. We're going to head in to the edges of this, create a wet into dry blend, and start creating that more semi-transparent edge, which will create a lot of depth in the cloud. So for this next step, here we do have a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we're going to use this again to work on those edges. I want to use this because it does render those sharp edges when we want them, but it's also going to be much smaller, so we'll be able to work with some details. We're going to be using the same purple that we were using, and let's hop into it. So I'd like to start over here on this edge because we're going to have a couple of different movements happening. And I'm going to begin in the body here of the purple. If your purples don't match absolutely perfectly, if you take a break, that is okay, because we are actually, again, going to go in and apply a lot of pigment to the middle of this, and you can also drag it down, but don't worry about that too much right now. You just want a fairly consistent purple. And then as you get towards the edges here, I'm going to use less pressure and these kind of sweeping motions to create a movement in the cloud, so it looks like wind is pushing it, it's dynamic, but I'm also not applying as much pressure. So you get these semi-transparent areas as you can see right there. Now, I'm also going to take my brush, I'm going to dip the bottom third of it in a little bit of water, I'm going to wipe off the excess, and now I have a damp brush. So, when I grab that pigment and I go to do this again, it'll be even more thin, which means I'll get an even more semi-transparent edge occurring here. Now, as you can see right there, it can be a little bit of an issue in that you're not going to have such an opaque application, so you have to use more paint, you have to go over areas a number of times, but it's worth it because it's going to allow you to do more with that pigment. Now here, yet again, I'm working very softly. I'm applying almost no pressure with my brush, and as you can see, I'm moving almost no pigment at this point, but we are starting to get that movement. We are getting that semi-transparent application, and things are starting to work the way we want. Now here again, you can see that it's wisping up. You can also have a piece that wisps up and then moves this way. So again, we're trying to use similar techniques so that it looks cohesive, but we're also trying to continuously change it up in one way or another. You can see that this patch, it kind of dips to up. This patch kind of goes more flat but has a couple bumps. Then there's this immediate dip to up, and then it's another little swing effect. Just try to make sure that it's always evolving. And again, if your purple is a little bit off, you should do multiple layers in here anyway, so I am just bringing that down. I'm going to grab slightly more water. We'll head down to the bottom where typically it won't look as feathered as this up here. And feathered is just generally a term used to note that the middle of something is a bit more opaque and then the edges are more semi-transparent. So we are going to have a little bit of that feathered effect in that these edges here are going to be slightly transparent, but not to the same extent as the top there. Now, I do have a little bit left here. I have a lot of water on my brush, which means I might not get as opaque an application as I'd like here, but we'll see. Sometimes you also need to let it dry to really get the proper answer. And here I'm almost leaving a little opening between these two, but you can definitely see the effect the water has. This was done with water, this was not. So, again, positives and negatives. When you find you do have too much water on your brush, you can wipe it off. And I never try to go in with a wet brush, I always try to go in with a damp brush. I find that a damp brush gives you opportunities while a wet brush almost takes them away. So do wipe off the excess. With that said, when the brush is quite wet, if you don't want to go and dry it off and clean it and do all of that, you can just mix more thick paint to increase the ratio of paint to water on your brush. As we're doing right here, I'm mixing it on top of our previous mixture. That way, we get to kind of steal some of that initial pigment, make sure we're on the right track, but also because we get to compare it with the edges and also, again, make sure it's going to be what we want it to be. So, there we go. Going to start this at the bottom this time. And you can see just how different that is from that right there. And now we'll just blend up. And we have this full area with a secondary layer. We'll need a secondary layer there, but that initial application is now much more full, which is great. Now, this right here is also going to be quite interesting. So let's get quite close to that, as it doesn't have a defined form like the rest of this did. So now this right here is actually going to have a really neat effect because it works with our composition incredibly well. You can see how all of these movements are kind of leading the eye up this way and off the canvas, which is generally not what you want because you want things pointing in towards your main subject. Now, this is going to fix that. This is going to bring it all back together because the main movement is essentially going to be like this, and then it kind of flips back up this way. So the eye's following these lines, and then it hits that, and then it's
brought back into the painting. So these are little things we should always remember to incorporate in paintings that, you know, we kind of come up with our minds, or when we're taking photos, looking for compositions. These leading lines are really important, and they're going to play quite a big role in just ensuring that, again, the viewer stays invested visually, mentally in your painting for as long as possible. So here we had some white of the canvas. I'm going over that in the middle initially, making sure we have a nice, good, firm, thick application, and then I kind of work my way towards the edges as the pigment runs out, because then it's more thin and I can get those wet and to dry blends. And these wet and to dry blends, you can see a bit of the granular effect of the canvas. There is that little bit of tooth in there, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I personally love a more painterly effect in the canvas. I love when you can occasionally see a brush stroke, things of that nature. So I wouldn't shy away from that. And when you're working on such a big canvas, even if you don't really love it, it's something you can kind of get away with, because when you step back, there's so much detail that you really can't see the tooth of the canvas. So if you are someone who doesn't love that, working on big canvas can really be great, because it really won't be noticeable, because people don't have to be close to your canvas to see the details. Now here I'm kind of going over the edges with very, very minimal amounts of paint, no pressure, a little bit of water on the brush, and I'm getting this semi-transparent application. It's starting to look quite nice. Just dipping my brush in a little bit of more water, coming back, getting this edge right here. And you can see just how transparent that is in relation to that. And this is where depth starts to come in with your clouds. And you're going to incorporate depth in your clouds in a couple of different ways. The first is going to be through transparency in different areas. So we can go ahead, interject a little bit more to some of these edges. This is something you do in stages. You don't want to do too much at any one point. You want to build up to it. But this is the first way of going about it, and the second is going to be layering our second, third, fourth applications on top of this and building light in those areas. But this is going to go a long way by itself. So here you can see, just using that slight bit of water on my brush to blend this out, make that even more soft. Clouds will have hard edges. They will have some. It's dependent on the cloud, it's dependent upon the area of the cloud, the thickness of that area, a lot of different factors. I'm just kind of looking at the reference photo right now, and I notice that it actually extends out this way, and it touches the edge of the canvas, but it's very subtle. So that's what I'm trying to keep this right here. There we go. Holding the canvas to kind of ground it in the easel a little bit better. Take out a little bit of movement. Now there's another one right here, and I'm just kind of drawing this on essentially with a little bit of water at this point, because there isn't really much pigment on my brush, and it's going to lead up, follow back. So let's get the camera a little bit higher and we'll work on this one, because it's different in that we're no longer working on a brighter backdrop like we are here. It's now quite dark, and I think a lot of us would naturally feel inclined to then make it so much more brighter and make it really pop and, you know, keep that contrast. But having subtle elements will really help with the depth as well, and this will be a great example of that. So we are now a little bit higher on the canvas. You can see that initial application right there. We're going in with some additional paint. And I think it needs to kind of come back down here, but very softly. I'm now almost out of paint. My brush is slightly damp, so I'm able to just get this slight blend. It is, again, wet into dry, because the base layer, the sky itself, is dry, while this is wet. You'll be doing this a lot more with acrylics, because the dry time is so quick. Where with oils, it's essentially almost always wet onto wet. Here you can see I'm trying to create a slight movement of this down into here. You'll notice that these clouds aren't particularly bright, despite the fact that they are up against this darker backdrop of the sky. And you'll also notice that while we're going about this, I am heading back down, working on these areas as well, just kind of continuously touching up these things. It is another process that's going to look rough initially, but it is all going to come together. It is all going to look really beautiful in the end. And it's just about trusting that process and recognizing that layering here. And little touch-ups are going to go a long way. There we go. Really like this so far. Okay. Do another little cloud right here. That way we have one cloud that kind of moves up in this odd shape, and then we have another one that kind of dips in like that, and then we have another one that reaches down like that, and you can see they're all very, very diverse at this point. Here I'm just going in and softening one of them. So now as we step back and we look at this, in comparison with this, we see what a slightly refined area looks like in contrast with a not refined area. So all we did with this top part was, we went back in with the paint, we didn't have much pressure, we had a little bit of water on the brush, and we made those extra smooth transitions. The same can be done right down here by, going over those areas yet again and softening. This is only the first application of softening. It's already making a difference, as you can see, and we can definitely make this a lot cleaner with a little bit of extra time. But this is essentially the process we go through to make these edges look as nice as we can with this brush. So, just jumping back, grabbing my palette. I really like to move around a lot when I'm working on larger paintings so that I can ensure that I am consistently stepping back and getting a nice wide perspective of it, making sure that things are progressing in each area the way they need to, that the areas are balanced and flowing. Highly recommend it. When you start off with your brush and you have a lot of pigment on it, I like to kind of begin in the middle just to get some of that paint off the brush. And then once I feel like I have a lesser amount, a more easily controllable amount, then I work to my edges, I start softening things. Let's combine that. Taking a couple little artistic liberties here, changing the reference photo minorly just to kind of continue making the piece what we want it. There we go. Definitely getting there. And again, if you look at these purples, they're a little bit off. Not worried about that at all. That's not the focus right now. If you have them perfect, that's fantastic, but don't worry about it. Do a really soft cloud in here. Just using a little bit of water and the remaining pigment on my brush. So you can see how this kind of moves back and then behind that area right there. It's a bit of a different look and effect than what we've created thus far. I'll go into the middle, just thicken it slightly. Like that. So now, yet again, we are going to mix up some new paint. We go through a lot of paint on these larger canvases, so we do get the opportunity to continuously remix. And as you can see, I just kind of grabbed amounts that I thought would be correct for this. We were actually quite off this time. Sometimes we are right there, sometimes we are not. But I can tell that it's too bright and it's not saturated enough. So I'm going to start by both darkening it and adding saturation by adding some blue and red. About equal amounts, if anything. I'll slightly lean it towards blue. But this is going to darken it because these two values are darker than what we had, and they're going to saturate it because we are moving the pigment less away from black and white and gray. Then I'm just taking some Mars Black and completing that mixture right there. So, once we have this, we're going to head up to the edge over here. I'm going to look at my reference photo, just find the basic movements. I can tell that there's actually something really interesting that's happening right here. This is going to jet out. This is going to come down. And then we essentially work our way back into the middle of the cloud. We're going to paint over all of this right here. So again, I'm not too worried if the purples don't match perfectly. I actually did this yesterday. We are painting on day 2 right now. So that's why I don't have the exact colors. I didn't continue mixing with what I had. You can mix them though if you just spend a little bit of extra time. It just isn't necessary for this portion of it. So I'm eliminating all of the white edging. And then I don't have much pigment on my brush. So now I'll start softening edges. Not using much pressure. I'm continuously rotating my brush too, that way I don't end up with anything that looks stroke-wise like the actual edge of the brush. And you can see when I'm doing this blend, I'm not working that way with it. I'm using the wide edge and the body to do a lot of the work. There we go. Looking quite nice. And now I'm softening. Minimal pressure. Minimal pressure. A little bit more pressure here just because I saw a bit of white showing through. And then back to minimal pressure. The technique is something you are going to get really quite good at over the course of this painting because you have to do it quite a lot, and it's just a great exercise for learning how to paint and blend wet on to dry. So here I'm going back to this yet again, continuing to build out those semi-transparent edges. Yeah, there's little pieces kind of coming off of it. And if you find you do have a slight hard edge in there, like what you see here, you can always just grab more paint and continue building that transition from something more stark to something transparent. And again, might as well move some extra paint down here. This is going to make it a bit more cohesive. It's going to give us a more thick layer, which is great. Just like that. I'm also going to try to eliminate this harsh edge that I have right there. It's something that we are going to paint over anyway, but it's a lot easier to paint over soft edges than it is hard edges because hard edges can show through a little bit. So just by making things a little bit more edge friendly, we make our future job a lot easier. Okay, so this side, edge-wise, is just about complete. I do want to touch up this area a little bit, but I'm fairly happy with that. So I think I'll probably spend maybe 5 minutes just going back, softening edges like this, and then you and I will head over to the other side of the canvas and smooth that all out as well. We'll also continue to create some different dynamic shapes like we did here. Now, as we head into refine edges like this and clean up those areas, I'm actually going to switch to a small round pointed brush. This one is about 1/4 of an inch, and we can use that soft edge to deliver some really soft applications that are void of any real lines. But if we want line work, we can use the tip of it, which is quite sharp. So I'm going to head over here to our palette. My brush is a little bit damp. I'll grab some pigment, and I'll look at this area right here, which is quite granular. Again, I think that is okay. I do like a painterly look, but if you want to soften things like this, I did want to show you how would you go about that. So here you can see I'm just working that brush in there. I'm working predominantly in little circles with this brush. So here I'm filling in all of that granular area, and then I start to work out of it a little bit. So try to grab some more pigment. We're just about out. We will need to mix some more relatively soon. But here you can see I'm expanding the cloud. I'm getting that really nice semi-transparent, clean look. Like that. Bouncing around a little bit. And it's amazing what a difference this sort of thing can do to your painting. Again, I'm using the edge of the brush, not the tip, because this is going to give me those soft applications. And because we're moving back and forth, we can kind of work around all grooves of the canvas here and almost eliminate the blue and the white that still kind of show through. So here I'm just kind of trying to find some extra purple. We'll work over this area. You can see we thicken that. We can use the tip to create a smaller, nice little cloud in the distance there. Then maybe we'll do another one. It's semi-transparent. Those are really nice. Things like that create a lot of depth because they show scale to the rest of it. The fact that clouds can be this small means that these ones are absolutely massive. And here we have another nice linear one. These aren't in the reference photo. I just thought they'd be a good addition for us. And then here, again, you can see I'm going around those edges, softening things. And it already looks so much better. Jumping around a little bit so I don't overdo any areas. I can kind of take breaks, take steps back, look at it, make sure it's progressing in the way I want. And I think I want portions of that to be slightly more opaque. So we'll find some additional pigment here, work that into the middle of it, keep the edges more transparent. And now it connects so much better to the painting. But with that, I think it's time again to head on over to the other side. So we're going to begin right in this area right here. I am moving back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush because we need to work with a larger area. So I will start by mixing up a good amount of additional pigment right here. Again, working on top of that previous mix, so I know that it's just right. And here it actually looks a little bit more purple, a little bit brighter. I think I'm going to give that a try, just because that does look a little bit brighter than that. And as you can see, it definitely leans more towards red. So we'll interject some extra blue. You can give that a try. I think it needs to be a bit brighter, which will desaturate it, so we might need to add in some extra saturation. These are the questions you should be asking while you're working on it. And you know what? I think that's just about what I want. So I know that this side down here actually kind of comes up like this. It has this swirling motion in there, and then the body of it has another little piece that's smaller than this one, but still relevant. And then we move down. There's a little bit of a movement upwards. This needs to be extended. Again, what we did initially was very rough. We were just putting in a base layer, figuring out where things are so that we could do this, not even detail work, but further shaping, because the detail work really happens with that other brush, that smaller brush, relatively soon. But here, now that I am again running out of paint, I'm just going over these areas, more of a swirling motion than anything. You can tell that this pigment is a little bit different from what's around the edge, but that's fine. So, I know that there's also a little bit of a cloud in here. It's much more transparent though, so we're not going to do too much with that. And then this top area, we'll have come down like that. And just like that, we have what we need. So we're going to head over there. I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and damp again. Just dip the bottom third in some water, wipe it off on the cloth, mix some additional pigment, take off the extra if you feel like you've grabbed too much. Looks like we'll need to grab some extra red very soon. Let's see if we can complete this mix. Definitely needs more white and black. It's too saturated right now. What does that look like? It's a little bit brighter. What does that look like? Okay, so we're now getting something that's a little bit more blue rather than red heavy. And that should be what we want. So this is great. Here, I'm going to work in circles. As you can see, I am applying a bit more pressure into the canvas right now because I don't have a lot of water on my brush. I don't need to worry about it kind of ripping up paint. I'm trying to eliminate any possible edge between this and this. And now I'll start relieving pressure, and oh, look, semi-transparent. It's working quite well. There we go. Just doing a semi-blend, nothing too dramatic. Grab some additional pigment here. We know that it's going to come down right around this rock structure, so it hypothetically goes up there. I think we'll lose portions of this rock structure, but that's fine. Just thinking about it, making sure that we are making the right moves here. I think that this should be purple. So here you can see it's quite thin. That's okay. It's just a reminder that we need to go back to that area. Right now it isn't our primary focus. We know that we need a cloud here, and then we have another one here-ish. So I'm just putting a mark on the canvas, very light, so I know. With that said, I do need more red, so I'm going to put that on the palette, and then we'll continue working on this together. So we now have some new fresh red here on our palette, and we can start mixing up a bit more of the purple we were previously working with. So, again, same area, and you're probably curious as to why we don't simply mix just so much of this from the beginning. And in short, by going back and repeatedly mixing these colors, you'll get so much better so quickly at color mixing, and it'll make the future paintings you work on so much easier. So that's why we're doing this. Just trying to improve our skills. With that, I am now going to go into this more white-ish area. I'm going to fill in all of that right there in the middle, and then when I run out of paint, or rather start to, I'm just going to work my edges, again, circular motions, as little pressure as possible. I had a bit of pressure here so you can actually see some line work, but as I continue to go, there is less and less pressure. It gets more transparent. I'm going over it with a couple of different angles stroke-wise sometimes, just to give it some movement and intentional movement. When you do this, generally you don't get much movement, but if you do get some, it's a bit more randomized and you don't have as much control, where here I'm looking to get as much as possible. So here again we have that flipping motion. We'll have this flip kind of back up here. That way we don't have all of these arrows kind of pointing off the canvas. Here you can see that the edges are still a little bit rough, they're toothy, just like in the previous application on the other side, but remember we just go in and we fix that with the smaller brush in a little bit. So this is actually just what we'd like. Now, with that, I think my next step is going to head up to the top corner, continue doing that, and I'm just going to move that kind of down in this direction to continue that same idea, and then I'll probably just fill in this with one more layer. From there, we can work on the edges, refine them, and then we can start working with a brand new color and really start building some depth. So, top right hand corner here, I'm going in with a slightly lighter purple than what we used for this edge, because I do want that transition, I do want a slight gradient here. So we will blend back into this, try to create a slight transition, trying to alleviate any hard edge that might be created between the two purples. And that looks fairly good. So, now I'm just going to make sure my brush is nice and damp again, because we are going back towards this edge, and we are going to want things to be a bit more transparent. Here you can see my strokes are going like this a lot. It's still circular, but in the end of that circle, I'm going this way. That way it leads into this. Kind of feels like it's flowing, connecting. That's exactly what you want. When you hear people talk about the rhythm of movement in pictures or paintings, this is essentially that. Making sure that that transition is fairly nice. And then we'll touch that up quite quickly here. Doing the same thing. And that is good. It's very good. So I think my next step is actually going to be applying one more layer, kind of making this slightly more cohesive. And then again, we'll head back, we'll fix up the edges, and we'll clean it up together. So now, yet again, we are going to grab some of that purple that we have here. We will work that along those edges with the smaller round pointed brush, and we're just going to clean up some of those more toothy edges. This will also, of course, give us the opportunity to interject any sharp lines or new clouds, should we want to. That looked really nice, I liked that a lot. We'll also work that down here, again working in circular strokes. You can see how these clouds are all different. They connect up here, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot going on in this area. Thicken that one just a little bit. And we'll soften this transition right here. But all in all, I think this area already looks pretty fantastic. So we'll head over to the right-hand side. So right here, you can kind of see a little bit of an edge that's happening, and that is easily going to be remedied by just taking more of that pigment, initially placing it in the fully opaque area, and then blending it out to the semi-transparent area with those circular strokes. There we are. It's one technique that just works wonders in so many spaces and makes a cloud that initially may have looked a little messy so much more clean. And you can make your your movements rather, just so deliberate. Here we'll have another little cloud kind of coming off that. Little things like this are fantastic. I'll do another one, slightly different size, shape. Maybe I'll extend that. Create it more of a linear piece right there, but it's so soft and subtle, right? Not everything has to be high contrast. The bottom area there, yet again, much like the other half, is, I think, the weakest area visually, and so it'll require a bit more work. Starting again in those opaque areas, and then we blend to the edge as we start to run out of paint. We're applying quite a bit of pressure right here. Now we have this little piece that jets out, creates some extra movement. This kind of has an abrupt stop right here, so you know what, I think we'll drag that out. We'll make something a bit more linear, like we did on the other side. Won't be the same, but it'll be the same idea. Getting quite close here. You can see that I'm also jumping from area to area just to make sure things are how we want them to be. We don't have to finish an area and then just kind of leave it. We can always go back. And editing certain portions of your painting will have you kind of going back and editing other portions as well. It's just kind of the nature of balance. There we go. Okay, so I am quite happy with all of that, and now I think it's time that we switch our water, because our water will be very diluted with Mars Black and those darker gray pigments, and then we'll start mixing a brand new color and start building some depth and some highlights on the clouds. So our next step is to go back into here, start adding those highlights, build with some different colors. But again, before that, make sure your water is clean, make sure your brushes are clean, and again, take a couple steps back. Look at the shape of your clouds, make sure everything is moving in the way that you want, and that it does look quite diverse. So I'm actually very happy with this at this point. There are some discrepancies with different brush strokes here and there, but again, we're covering most of this. That isn't an issue. We just needed a nice, thick, good-looking, good-colored base layer and all of our movements and edge transitions. So we have all of that, and it's time to jump into the next step. I'm going to be jumping into the next step here with, again, that 1-inch flat-headed brush. And we now have a bit of our yellow here on the palette, and the yellow is, double checking, cadmium yellow light hue. We're using this because it's actually a very bright yellow, so we won't have to interject a lot of titanium white to brighten oranges and desaturate them. So it's quite versatile. It does a lot for your painting. But with that said, I am going to start here with some of our red. Move that down. I'm going to grab maybe about half that in our yellow. We have a nice orange, but it is much too saturated and vibrant. So we're going to grab some titanium white. This is going to brighten it, but it's also going to bring it down in saturation. Then we're going to add a hint of Mars Black, and we don't want to add too much because, again, it's a very strong pigment. It could very easily overtake what we have here. And if you have too much yellow and too much Mars Black, you actually get a green. So we need to ensure that this does continue to be a red dominant orange. Otherwise, it will no longer be orange. I'm also going to add in just a small hint of blue. Keep it consistent. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to test it down here. And I can see that it's actually significantly darker than what I need. So that's good information. We'll add in a lot of titanium white. Just like that. Test that. Oh, that's actually really close. That's fantastic. Okay, we need a hint more red. Maybe a little bit more. We need slightly more titanium white. And that looks really close to what we need. And you can see how the color transitioned. We didn't go with our first option. We kept experimenting, and that is fantastic. So, now I'm looking for the brightest point, because this is essentially the brightest pigment we're going to use. And I'm going to start working this out for our cloud. Now, going in the brightest areas, I'm working my way out towards the areas that dissipate and get darker. Doing all of this in a similar application to how we did the clouds before, but what's really interesting here, is that we are going to get those not perfect edges and blends like we did previously, and that's something we are going to have to go in and touch up and fix. So recognize that what we're doing right here is, again, it's more of a practice layer, it's more of a base layer. We're going to have to go over a lot of this all over again, and that's okay. So again, I'm finding all of the areas that are going to be quite bright, and I'm applying this pigment here. Then as I run out of paint, I'll go towards my edges, do more of that rounded gradient, dissipates into the purple. It's going to look messy, that's okay. Let's get you a little bit closer. So here we are slightly closer. I can apply more of that pigment back in the middle, and you'll notice that it actually looks brighter than it did the first time, because acrylic paints are semi-transparent. The more you stretch them, the more water you add, the more thin they get. So you'll get to see portions of that darker base layer behind. So by going back in and adding additional applications, you build that and you get more of the natural color that we have here on the palette. And this is kind of how we are going to, in a way, start building some depth, because if you look at this and this, these look more lit, more poppy than the areas surrounding. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to happen. So now I'll blend, while I don't have too much paint, this down into this. You can see how we have this semi-transparent mixture going on here with these real highlights popping up right there and there. We'll follow this towards the edges a little bit more. All of the finer detail and all of the real crafting will be done with the smaller 1/4 inch brush. But for now, we're trying to find our shapes, we're trying to find our values. There we go. Doesn't look like much yet, but it will. We'll get there. There we go. You can see that I'm slowly just adding in more, expanding, really in all directions. Watching my reference photo, thinking about where the light's coming from. The light's probably coming this way. Illuminating this, that means as the cloud kind of dips in, it gets darker over here. There we are. It's turning out really nice so far, actually. Especially for the unrefined layer. So now we'll go back, we'll grab more, I'm just going to build these areas up a little bit. Give us some spot highlights in there, which we will build on in a couple of minutes. And some spot highlights over here as well. There. Now I am going to go for a slightly darker, more orange mix, but I am going to add the smallest hint of cerulean blue. I want something a little bit darker than what we currently have there. Remember to keep red as your prominent color. And then you can slowly work in more yellow, and if you ever feel that it's leaning away from the orange into the green, then you add more red. But there we have a slightly darker version. It's a little bit more warm. You can see I'm working in those circles. As we move farther away from the light, and we're achieving this really nice gradient. So, dipping my brush in some water again, wiping off the excess, grabbing more of that slightly darker pigment, and I think I'm actually going to work that right down here as well. I don't want this to be too bright, it's going to get a little bit of a shadow. We're almost using a glaze at this point in that the water's, or rather the pigment's quite thin, so we're adding just a bit of color on top of our previous application. There we go. Now I'm just about out of that pigment, so we'll remix. This time I know that I like it, so I'll mix a bit more of it. Smallest hint of blue. I almost always test my blue in that scenario off to the side, just so I don't accidentally grab too much on my brush and bring it to an area where it's not really going to work well. So here we go, yet again. It's a bit darker. I'm going to test it on my reference photo, and I can see that it's actually far too red, definitely needs to lean more into purple. So here I am going to work in some blue. And because it was so red dominant, we got something more purple than we did green. So that's perfect. And again, we're painting wet into dry. Fairly soon this cloud's going to start making some more sense. With that said, I do think we're going to move that way a little bit. We're going to work on some of the greater highlights in these, and then we'll continue to fill in the darker areas together. So here, yet again, we need significantly more of that. So I will grab a lot more paint than I initially did. Again, we generally don't mix too much paint initially, just because going back and remixing it does make you a much stronger painter. But once you have a good eye for it and you know what you want and you kind of know how to make it, then it's okay to start working in more. And you can see that I'm very slowly adding in more Mars Black to this mixture. It's not something I want a lot of initially. Let's test this over up here. It's even brighter than what we have. So that's quite nice. I do like it. I'm testing it on my reference photo. It looks really good. But I think I do want it to be a little bit darker. So we'll add in a bit more orange because both of those values are darker than white. We'll add in, again, another hint of blue. All right, we'll test that. And that looks quite good. So now I'm going to use this over here. This right here is kind of coming up that way. It's in front of this portion of cloud, so it's going to receive quite a bit of light. So I started with that edge and then I started working my paint back because that's how the light's going to work. It's going to hit that edge and then it's going to wrap its way around. So we're just working intuitively, essentially. And then as I start to run out of paint, as we move towards the right, we go back into that circular motion. I do a little bit of a wispy effect right there. Remember, this is our first layer, so it'll be semi-transparent. So you are going to see through that a little bit. It's going to look a little bit darker. It's okay. And you can see that we're essentially trying to get all of the left-hand edges fully applied with this, and then the right-hand ones can dissipate and get darker. Circular strokes. Doing a bit of a grind in the canvas. Getting there. Really getting there. I'm also going to take a minute, while I don't have much pigment on my brush, to kind of work these back a little bit too. And if you make anything too bright, also don't worry about it because we can make it darker again. Here you can see that we're just crafting more of those edges and then doing more of that blend back. This area right here is quite bright. There we go. Starting to look like clouds, isn't it? Really happy with this, actually. Generally, I think it goes for a much more awkward stage at this point. And you're kind of questioning the process as you go. It's like, is this really what I want to do? Is this really the approach I want to use? And eventually you get to what you want. But generally it isn't this visually forgiving. So I'm quite happy. You can see here how that's a bit darker. You can see that through this circular stroke. There are little areas that are darker and it makes it look like there are these slight movements in the cloud, which are fantastic. They also add a lot of depth. I'm going to make my brush a little bit more damp as we blend up into here. Remember that this area as a whole should remain fairly dark because it's blocked by this part of the cloud, which is much more light. And we're going back and doing that over here as well. So now what we can do is we can take a bit more of this and start building up the highlights in these areas as well. See that? We're just essentially painting with light. We now have light hitting the edge of those. They are really brightening up. Starting on the left-hand side, and then I'm doing blends to the right, doing blends down, sometimes blends up. But once you have that fairly soft base layer, it's so easy to just paint on volume, paint on light, create that depth, and really have a lot of fun with it. Here, running out of paint, kind of connecting that area with that area. I am bringing a fair amount of extra light over to the shadow side, but we'll be careful with it. We won't add too much. We'll keep it consistent with everything else. There we go. I think that turned out really quite well. And it's really funny how this gradient in the background probably took us 20 minutes. This flat purple that we had probably took us 40, maybe 50 minutes. And then this color, this volume, this depth, significantly less. And that's just acrylic painting. And that's why I keep saying, have faith in it. We'll get there. Need your base layers first. Okay, so I am almost out of pigment here on my palette. We'll mix up more. Yellow, red, quite a bit of white. That looks very pink. We'll add some yellow to make it a bit more orange. We'll add the smallest bit of blue. There we go. We need a bit of Mars black in there because we don't want it to be too saturated. And that was actually more black than this could handle. So for the first time, it actually did find itself closer to a bit of a green. And we remedy that by just adding some extra red. So I'll test this down in my reference photo. It's not the brightest pigment, but it is relatively bright. So we'll test it here. Good. Still cohesive. It's okay to have multiple pinks and oranges and colors of these natures in here. It'll actually make it much more interesting. So, I think what we'll do now is add a patch of light right here. I can see one in the reference photo. There's a little bit of light right there. There's a little bit of light right there. There's some light. That's really catching right there. There's a little bit right there. So now that we have these, again, blend out from them. Predominantly to the right-hand side, but you can do a little bit on the other side if it protrudes. We're just building our clouds. You can see that these two are now starting to connect nicely. That into this. Using very minimal pressure when I want it to be a very thin blend. Going over most of the edges of our clouds right now. Not leaving many to be that actual dark purple. But I didn't intend to initially. There we go. So far so good. Truly. Okay, so from there, I think it's time to start building again. So I'm going to take more of that pigment, I'm going to find the areas I really want to have that highlight, and I'll just build on top because, again, it's transparent, and now it's less transparent, and now we have more of the natural color that we actually want in there. Deviating from the shapes in the reference photo a little bit, I want this to be slightly brighter than it was in the reference photo. And that's okay. You can take artistic liberties, just make sure you're continuing to rebalance the pieces you go. I'm also jumping over here. Play with that. There. So much volume. Now, as I get over here, I don't want as much light. And I don't want as much light over there either. I want the light to be more centralized. So I do have quite a bit of water on my brush right now, which is making the paint more thin. I'm not applying as much of a stroke, or a pressure in my stroke rather. So we're going to see more of the purple through this new pigment. and this new pigment is going to be quite thin, which is going to make this area look darker, right? If you look at that and you look at that, and that looks a lot darker. And this is going to keep things much more centralized visually.
I am so excited to go into this with the small brush and really touch it up. I think this sky is going to look incredible.
So, with that said, again, big brush. Get more of this. It's fairly watery. I'm going to start in the middle of this right here and slightly off to the left because the light's coming this way. It will hit that left-hand side, but I kind of want it to be positioned in a way that it's kind of moving into it rather than hitting directly from the side. So you get a gradient dramatically, you get a lot of it as it moves that way, and you get a little bit as it moves to the left. So I added the majority of my paint to that area, and now here we are, blending, 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 using a lot of very soft brush strokes, barely tapping the canvas. Water is on my brush. It's quite damp right now, probably the most damp it's been. That said, if you make it wet, it will be a bit difficult to work with and you won't really be able to build up pigment. And if you find that happens by accident, just let it dry fully and then come back into it. Don't try to continue to work through it. You can create spots that are difficult to work on top of because they kind of achieve this new texture that the acrylic doesn't really want to bond with. But again, it's not something to worry about because if it happens, you can just stop painting, wait 5 minutes, probably 15 minutes in that scenario, make sure you're extra safe, and then come back to it, and then you'll be fine.
So there we go. Now that side even has some depth.
Oh, this is fantastic. Really enjoying myself here. I'm throwing in some smaller little portions of highlights on these clouds. This is some extra detail work that I think is just going to work out wonderfully. And then, again, I blend back to the right. Let it dissipate. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, make sure we're moving in the right direction. I think we are. So now I want something a little bit brighter than this. Start with our orange, grab a good amount of our titanium white. We already have something slightly brighter, which is good, but we'll grab a hint of Mars black. We won't overdo it like we did last time. We'll grab a hint of blue, won't overdo it. Test this up here. That looks very close to our initial bright pigment. So I'm going to add some of that extra highlight right down here. Build that up. Not too much. And I'm spreading it out more so than I did up here so that it is softer and not as stark. So again, the eye really remains in that central area. That's so imperative. You can take that beautiful color and you can move it about, but don't move it about too far. And if you do, make it slightly more subtle as you go to the left and right hand side. Again, I'm deviating from the reference photo a little bit right here, but I think that's okay. There we have a little horizontal cloud. That's quite nice. That leading down into there. I know you're visually a bit farther away. I do have the camera purposefully a bit farther away right now. And that's because we are working on here, we're working here, we're really jumping around a lot, and I think when you do that, it's imperative to be farther away from the canvas so you can make sure that things are, as we've talked about 100 times, balanced. It's really difficult to do when you are up close to the canvas. So we're just playing it really safe. I'm trying to paint from a little bit farther away. This is going to leave you with less control, but it's going to make your strokes a bit more loose and natural, so you won't fall into habit and you won't accidentally continuously recreate the same strokes. So there are a lot of benefits. There is initially a seeming, something that's seemingly negative, but it really isn't. And that's something to consider as well. But again, that's why we're so far away with the camera. Okay, taking a couple steps back. Here I did accidentally create quite a bit of repetition with that movement, that movement, and that movement, and then with that, that, and that. So this is something, again, to be wary of, to be careful with. This is quite bright, so I'm going to work that up here. Just make sure that this remains the most dominant area. And if you look, the highlight's right here. It's not directly on the edge. And the same idea is there. It's quite off to the left, but it's not perfectly on the left because you want a little bit of space to wrap that light around and give it some extra depth. There we go. Now, we did talk about that and how I wasn't the biggest fan. I'm going to make my brush very wet right now. I'm going to take off all of the paint. It's as wet as it has been. Going to work water over this in a circular stroke. And I'm just going to peel the paint off the canvas because it's still wet and it's that easy. See that? Worked really well. You can also do that here. And we did reveal a bit of the blue from the sky, which is actually, or the purple from the initial layer, which is actually quite interesting. Something to be careful of. If you were to try to add real paint on top of that again, like with something like that, it wouldn't stick because it's so watery right now. That needs to dry for 15 minutes before we would go back. But if you do add something you don't like, you can just add a lot of water to your brush, essentially use it like an eraser, take it off with your hand, a cloth, paper towel, and let it dry, then come back in and fix it up the way you really want to. With that, I was about to go and touch up these areas. Way too much water on this brush to do that sort of thing. So we're going to clean our brush, we're going to dry our brush, then we're going to head back into the details. And I think at this point we'll probably do so over there. So this is an area we haven't spent too much time on, but we're about to remedy that. So I'll start with a bit of a almost darker orange, darker peachy orange, because we have that highlight on there. It's nice. I think it's now time to start having that kind of dip off, get darker, but get a good transition of it. So we have our orange, we have our white to make it less saturated. Grab a little bit of Mars Black and we'll mix that down here. As you can see, it's on the cusp of green. So, more red. And this will look really nice as a transitionary color. We'll try it over here as a highlight. It doesn't really highlight, but it does act as a good middle step. So, let's apply that again in the body where it's a bit more opaque. And then we'll work our way over into the right hand side. That said, I think I could actually use a little bit more purple. You can see just how much it's leaning towards orange. So we will add some blue into that mixture, then we'll add a bit more red to balance it. Red really balances these things so well. Maybe a little bit more white, a little bit more black to desaturate it. There we go. I think that'll work a lot better. Yes. 100 times yes. There we are. Now I am going to move this darker pigment up over here to make this consistent, but I generally like to layer my lighter pigments on top of my darker pigments, so we're working backwards here, and I'm going to remedy that by just going back and adding more of a highlight in a little bit once we're done with this. Just working it enough in all of these other areas so that it feels nice and cohesive. There we go. I think that actually turned out great. And this is a technique, especially with acrylics, dry on or wet on to dry, that will up close you'll be able to see a lot of texture, a lot of brushstroke again, but when you step back it'll all just disappear and it's this really neat effect. I personally love that because I love the idea that you're reminded that it's an acrylic painting. I love painting. I love the medium of it. It's great to be reminded when you're up close that, you know, that's what it is. It's not a photograph. It's not another type of art. Not that there's anything wrong with other types of art, it's nice to keep painting alive, right? But with that in mind, I think it's just, I got distracted. I really loved this color. I started applying it and I was like, oh, wow, look at that. Where else can I put that? But when you step back again, you don't really notice the brush strokes at all. You just have this beautiful scene. And so you get or rather the best of both worlds, I think, with this type of technique and application. I'm not sure if you heard that. I think my stomach is getting a little talkative. We are currently working through what's generally a lunchtime, but it's so hard to put down the brush, especially at times like these, when things are just working out so well. With that, I will take more of my dark pigment, maybe mix it a little bit with my light pigment. We have this great in-between color. And this is actually quite transparent and definitely leans more towards purple in the reference photo, but I just think we have something really great happening right here, and I want to continue it subtly. I'm going to ensure that this area here does not get too bright, but I am going to continue with this slight highlighted warm pigment. Going to apply it more so to the tops than the bottoms, because the bottoms will have more shadow, right? Where the tops will get more light, because hypothetically the sun is higher than the cloud. Those little details are things you can do with a smaller round-headed brush in a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to make slightly more of a highlight. Let's say this area right here, just this area maybe. It's poking out. It's catching that extra light. Light's coming that way. Light's catching the right-hand side. We are building depth with it. You can see that a lot of my strokes arch down. So there's a consistent movement in it, but they're not always on the same angle or at the same slope, which is why it's going to be consistently changing and interesting. There we go. Maybe we'll add a little bit of this semi-highlight up here. Again, this is something you can do with the smaller brush. You'll probably get a slightly better effect with it, but we can touch it up later, and I just kind of want to test it. Let's say that this right here is getting some highlight. It will quickly dissipate, but it'll make this larger dark cloud, which is simply dark in the reference photo, much more cohesive in our painting.
So as we step back here, we can see how everything is really starting to come together. We do have a lot of volume in these clouds. It is very apparent that the light is moving in from the left-hand side and building on these. However, we've been spending a lot of time building up these larger masses and shapes, and something we've neglected to do along that process that is going to make this look significantly more natural is the incorporation of smaller clouds like what we did with the purple. However, we're going to do that with the highlights because right now we have essentially a couple very large bodies of highlight, and the eye essentially bounces from one to the other rather than being led from one to the other. And we also don't have that same sense of scale that we did when we had everything in purple, because we had these really large purple clouds and then these smaller ones to make the large ones look even larger. Where with this, we don't really have those smaller orangey pink ones like what we have right there and there. We need them more spread out. It'll give us a much better sense of depth, and it also will make the cloud just feel form-wise a lot more natural. So let's get in right close, let's start adding those, and while we're at it, let's also mix up some of those mid-tones to dark ones and interject them back into the highlights and just kind of go back and forth with the balance until we get exactly what we want. So let's just keep learning, keep having fun, and make the best sky we can. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take some of our yellow, some of our red, start up with a nice orange, some titanium white, desaturate it, Mars black, darken it a hint, not too much, a little bit of blue in there as well, maybe a bit more red, yellow, made it relatively dark there, which is okay, but we'll just give it a bit more orange, give it a bit more red, and make it slightly more bright and saturated. It's nice that we have that range. So now we'll test this close to some of our other ones, and as you can see right there, it's actually a little bit bright, and it's definitely not as saturated as what we want. So we'll get some more red, some more yellow, a little bit more red, and there we go. Now it's feeling vibrant again. We'll test that. And that is looking really quite good. I think it just needs to be desaturated. We'll probably have what we want. Okay, so now I'm going to take this and let's start building down a little bit. Creating these smaller clouds. This one can protrude, catch a bit of extra light there. Let's add this pigment up here just so it feels nice and cohesive with everything else. We'll also add some of this highlight over here. Maybe a bit in there. You don't want to use a new color in one area because if it is off a little bit, it'll be a bit distracting. So I like to reincorporate in just a myriad of different spaces. We'll also take this and, we'll make this darker purple cloud brighter on the top, on the left-hand side as well. Going to make sure my brush is a little bit more damp. That way I can get the really fine, sharp strokes. They'll be more transparent, but that's okay. It's all about balance. So now I can go back into this, clean it up, blend the back out a little bit. The water on the brush is really helping me do this portion of it. And I think I want slightly more pink in this mixture now. So I'll just throw in some extra red. Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, the combination of the slightly more gold and pink highlights together really make this special. So just by adding that little bit of detail there, that little bit there, we really build on our clouds. We'll have another piece that kind of protrudes and jets out right there.
But you can see how just a little bit of extra time can make such a big difference on such a big piece. So don't forget to go back in and just do those little clouds, those little touch-ups that seem insignificant, but really make it so much more natural. There we go. There we go. Okay, so we've added detail right up there, and we want to add detail throughout the piece, but while we're in this area, I also want to show you how to darken pigments as well, because that is important. We are going to add a lot of highlights, and we're going to want to balance them at some point. So let's get a darker purple, something similar to what we used initially for the background. Probably need a bit more red in there. Just do a little test. Okay, it's a little bit brighter, that's good. And now we'll make it more orange. So, hint of yellow, a lot of red. Definitely needs significantly more red so it doesn't turn into green. Some titanium white. Getting there. A little bit more red. Quickly getting there, we're comparing it with our highlight. Okay, let's test this. Oh, that looks great. Okay, so now we have a bit of a darker pigment. And I'm just going to wrap this around this larger highlight right here. So what this is going to do, this is going to make this look like a shadow, and this look like it's protruding out from that shadow. So now I'm going to, once I start trying to paint, work in a bit of a swirling motion. And blend that out. So it looks like this is casting a shadow on this, and then there's extra light up here because this is no longer at an angle in which it can cast that shadow. You can also add little shadows in here. Just trying to diversify that shape a bit more. Have these little openings in the cloud. I'm also doing a bit of finger painting, which is always a lot of fun in these. There we go. Now, because we've added so much depth in this area, I almost feel like we need to go back into this and improve upon it a little bit, just because the more detail you add in one area, the more you're going to have to balance it in others. And sometimes that means adding detail, sometimes that means taking out detail. In this case, I think it means adding in the form of volume, but right now I'm just using a bit of a damp brush to clean up this edge a little bit. Trying to make sure that it's always changing. I noticed in the reference photo that this area was actually a bit darker up here, which is kind of what sparked the idea. There we go. Now we can go back to the brighter pigment. And we will need more yellow fairly soon. That's okay. Not quite yet. So there we go. It's a nice highlight. Oh, that is a really nice highlight. Okay, so now we're building on the edge of this newly formed, slightly smaller cloud. Starting those highlights on the left-hand side. And then I'm building in, but I'm not covering all of it. I'm still creating these little pockets of highlight. So, see there, that's darker, that's darker. I'm still doing the blending back technique, but just not everywhere. I'm being selective. I think we can also add in some slightly more highlighted areas up here as well. That can kind of come out from behind this, but in front of this. working clouds in between other clouds is another great way of getting some depth in that painting. See that? It's a brighter value than what we have behind there. It's fairly similar to that. Definitely helping. And it's a little bit darker, so you can even use it in the shadows for this a little bit. So after I said that, I thought, you know what? I think this is a great time to step back. So we're doing that, we're reassessing, we're kind of looking at it in relation to everything else balance-wise, and I love this. I think that is such a beautiful, eye-catching area that really complements the rest of the piece well, but it also makes it apparent just how little detail that and that have. And we don't want too much detail in them because we don't want it all competing too much, but we also don't want too little detail in them. So I want less than that, but more than they currently have. I also want to ensure that we're doing little things like that, kind of out of the areas of these main zones to again continue balancing. So with that, we're going to hop back into that one, continue adding some detail, and we'll play with it from there. So now we are working over here. My brush is going to be slightly damp. We are starting with our highlight. So orange, white, hint of Mars black, and I'm still adding the smallest hint of blue, but you really don't have to. It's not necessary, but I think it makes the color slightly more diverse, and I like that. So I didn't test the color initially where I should have, but as you can see, we actually did get lucky, and it's really quite similar to what we have. Again, we're starting with something that's a little bit more orangey gold, but we can incorporate some pink into it very shortly and build it into something that's very similar to what we initially had. So I think we'll have some of these kind of coming off the right hand side here. That way it looks like this is kind of a line of clouds that's separating, moving kind of towards us and not necessarily connected to this, and it'll give us an opportunity to play with more clouds on the outskirts like what we were doing initially. Now I will grab some extra red, make it more pink, a bit more peach. I'll work this into the left-hand side because when we added that red, we actually added a value that was slightly darker than our mix, so this actually acts well as a bit of a shadow, provided it's not significantly more saturated. There we go. Oh. Here I'm blending off the edge, making that softer, same way we did when we were refining the edges of the larger clouds. And I think I want something fairly bright for a second. So I'll add some extra white, yellow, red. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so we can bump up the saturation, or rather the value of this. The saturation is actually a little bit less. It's not as saturated. You could add more yellow to bump up the saturation. But here, I'm trying to even further pronounce how this area and this area are protruding. And then I'm blending back with that circular stroke. And I'm creating multiple areas that are, again, protruding and catching light in that small area. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, where it was initially 1, and then we have 1 off to the side here. Does need some extra saturation for sure there, so we'll add in some pink right behind it. We'll add in some pink behind this one as well. There we go. And then we can add a little bit more of that highlight into these, but not too much. Very good. Have that kind of coming up the top there. And it's really starting to turn into a very neat painting. Now, while we've been adding in a lot of detail here and here, and I really like those areas now, I do feel like this area ended up being a little bit messy. So what we're going to do, we're going to take some of our red, blue, more red than blue this time, because we do want this to be red dominant. We're going to grab a hint of yellow, a little bit more red. We're going to create a darker grayish purple. That again has a hint of yellow, so it's going to be less and less purple, right? We're going to continue to create this into a bit more of a warmer hue, something that matches all of the oranges and pinks that we have throughout here. So I'm applying this over an area that essentially had a lot of layering, but not deliberate layering that we kind of just scraped out earlier to figure out where different things were going to be. And now I'm going in with this pigment, I'm going over a lot of it, I'm just making it cohesive, and it's really bringing out the area around it as well. So this is why earlier I noted that it's okay if the purple is a little bit rough, if it's a little bit inconsistent, because we were going to go back, we were going to remedy some of these areas. You can even blend this into the backs of some of the oranges to get a nice clean look. Yeah, that worked really well. So it's one of those things, much like with everything else in acrylic painting, where if you don't like something, don't worry about it. Just keep layering. Let it dry, add some paint. We're still painting wet into dry. I'm still using those circular techniques. And we really, I think we cleaned that up quite well, actually. That said, I now kind of want to put something in between these two. I feel like they're fairly similar sized, right? And I don't want it to look like we're breaking the canvas in half with the two of them. So I kind of want to add an extra highlight piece in there. So we'll go back up to mixing over here. If you did end up getting a lot of blue on your brush and in your water from that last mixture, I do recommend cleaning your brush and your water, because otherwise you might end up with the greens. But we didn't use too much blue, so I think we're okay here. We're definitely okay. Yeah. So now I want to say, do we want to go above? Do we want to go below? I think we want to go below. So we're going to start just working in this new cloud formation. Now this isn't in the reference photo, so I'm just making this up on the spot. We'll do a slightly taller one up here. If you don't like something, remember, we can just go back in with the purple like we just did, cover it up. So don't be worried or too hesitant. Now I'll grab a little bit of extra red, because I do seem to like the pink more so on the right-hand side, with the left-hand side getting more of the gold color from the light. And I think that the two working in conjunction make a great balance. Then I'll make slightly more of a highlight. So we're adding in more of the yellow to, again, bring it back closer to the gold. Place that more on that right side again. Just build those up. And now we have some nice, small little clouds in there to really boost this. There we go. I think I do want to brighten that a little bit. We have quite a bit of this nice gold there. It's kind of throughout, but we didn't add too much right there. So we'll just do maybe an equal mixture of yellow and red to begin with. Quite a bit of titanium white. We really don't need any additional Mars black or blue in this right now, because we had some in our initial mixture, we had some on our brush, and we want this to be quite bright. So I'm starting with the strokes that are going to be the brightest by crafting the left-hand edge of this. And then I blend backwards very softly with that rounded stroke. I know visually it's quite far to the left-hand side of the screen right now. Again, I think it's just something that's better seen from a distance, because this whole time when you're painting this, make sure that you are also looking at this and this. That's how you're going to know if it's too bright, if it's not bright enough, if it's too detailed, if it's not detailed enough, how much of all of this to add. It's just, this gives you so much information about how to make that correct. So it's, again, just imperative that this becomes and remains a very pivotal part of your focus. That's so much better. Yeah, okay, good. I think I'm going to brighten it slightly more. Okay, I think we need a bit more yellow, not too much. We actually didn't get something brighter there. That's interesting. So more white, more yellow. More yellow, more white. That's definitely too yellow. So you can see how the color is warping as I edit it. There we go. That is a gorgeous glow. Just letting it run off my brush. I don't want it to get too much in there because that's where those highlights really start to fall. You can add just a hint of it over here. I don't want much at all, but just a hint. Yeah. There we go. We're going to be careful not to do it anywhere lower anymore, because this is such a bright pigment that it only really makes sense that it'll catch in the areas that there are no shadows, the areas that are really protruding, really catching that light. There we go. Okay. Let's take a couple steps back. So now as we step back, we can see just how apparent it is, how useful, how much just these little details add to areas like that, in contrast with that right there. Because initially they all had this amount of detail, and now they are flowing. You have these transitionary pieces that you get from one to the other. We have these other ones out here that are just kind of balancing it. And we have a lot of movement. This kind of points in here. These are angled that way, so they move in. These are all angled, so they move that way and move in. And this kind of leads back up in there and through there. So we're able to create a lot more of a dynamic piece. There's so many more leading lines, and it just gets so much more interesting. We also have a wider variety of hues and values, because if you look at this, that highlight, in contrast with that, there's a pretty big difference. And so this is just, again, friendly reminder. Go in, do the extra work. It does pay off. And we're not even done the sky yet. So I think we are going to head into that area right now, work on that together, and just continue to balance the piece in a really beautiful way. So here we are yet again, continuing to work with that 1/4 inch round pointed brush. And we're going to start building some highlights in here. Now, we'll begin in the same way we did previously with an orange. I just find that's the easiest starting point, especially if you're working in blue, because if you're already starting from orange, you don't have to work towards it. And I think it's a much easier process than starting with a purple and then trying to make it orange. I'll add a little bit of Mars Black, I'll add some titanium white, and initially here you can see that it is a bit more desaturated. We do have more Mars Black, we do have more blue, and this isn't that pigment, and that's purposeful. We want to start off with something that we can build on top of, that we can add to, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So we have these couple larger areas already established with highlights, and right now we're looking to continue building on those. So I'm applying this to the left-hand side initially. That's going to be catching light, and then as per usual I'm blending back to the right with these circular strokes. So we've started. Now let's get some titanium white. Let's saturate it slightly more, yellow, red. We're just building on that pigment. Now let's add to it again. And here it's a little bit brighter, not much, but a little bit. And I think it's already actually having an effect. Okay, good. So now more yellow, more red. And you notice that I'm also holding my brush in what might seem like a strange way. Normally we hold our brush like a pencil. In school, when studying painting, it was actually regularly taught that you hold a brush like this so that you paint farther away. It makes your stroke, again, a little bit more loose, but it makes things more free, and you generally get a more flowing composition or subject. I try to paint with both techniques just because I do think that they both are advantageous in one way or another, and I kind of switch back and forth. But just if you ever find that your painting again is looking a bit stiff or doesn't have the movement you want, or you're just repeating the same types of applications over and over again and you're kind of finding it hard to break pattern, then holding your brush like this can be a great way of going about it. And I like to do that with clouds because I know if I paint like this through all of it, I'll get a lot of pattern that I don't want. So, here we go. Painting slightly differently, and we'll get good results from it. Now again, I generally advise painting from a bit farther away, looking at it from a bit farther away, that way we can kind of look at everything else in relation to this. However, again, I'm holding the brush a little bit differently, and I wanted to show you kind of how the movements with the brush work when I hold it this way. So we are going to get right up close for just a couple of minutes. You can hear that kind of grind into the canvas, and I'm not going directly into the canvas, that will ruin the brush, but what you can do is use the side of it. That's what the feathered edge is for. That's how we are able to get these very smooth areas and transitions. There we go. So far, so good. Kind of thinking about making these kind of background clouds that are a bit farther away, so it kind of looks like the clouds move in, dip, and then come out that way. It'd be a really interesting dimensional piece if we can kind of pull it off. So I'm considering it while I'm working on this, but that's why I'm hesitating doing anything really up there right now. Just kind of seeing if that added detail is worth it, or if we'll need that area for extra bright values, because if it's farther away, chances are it'll either be very muted comparatively, because it'll have more shadow, or it'll be more so in the light and therefore much more bright. So we'll probably be doing something extreme with it. I'm just not sure yet what that's going to be, and I want to finish these areas so I know if I need something extreme in one way or the other, right? We are really building up a lot of color in here. That said, we are now approaching the left-hand side, and we need to start softening. We need to really calm down with it. So I'm going to progressively be adding less and less highlight. I'll be using slightly more water on my brush. So far, so good. I think this might be bothering me a little bit. I feel like this almost needs to be the bottom of the cloud, where this kind of implies that there's another piece unless this were to come out that way. That might be interesting. No, it's too complicated. Okay. And when I say it's too complicated, I don't mean it's too complicated in that we can't do it. I mean it's too complicated in that it'll make this area of the piece too distracting and not what we want it to be. So I'm going to mix up some of this more purple pigment. We'll take some red, we'll move it up here. We'll take some blue. Haven't mixed this in a little while. White, black. It's probably too bright. It's probably too red. It's probably too dark. It's probably too blue. There we go. Brighten it up a little bit. That might be it. Let's give it a try. You can see just how much extra color we've established in here with all of the oranges and that, because the purple looks flat and out of place, despite the fact that I'm sure this is what we initially used. So we are going to play with this. We're going to add some yellow to it. Potentially make it a little bit more green, but definitely less blue, less cool. Let's add a little bit more red and yellow again. And that is definitely closer. Need more white though. We're getting there. Still definitely too saturated though. Yellow, red, a little bit of blue. You can see we are moving farther and farther away from purple. Closer to gray. And this matches the rest of our painting so much better. When a color just isn't working and you can't figure out what to do, ask yourself if it's too bright, if it's too dark, if it's too saturated, if it's not saturated enough, or hue-wise, if it's too cool or warm, and then kind of play with it from there. Now we kind of have this harsh edge through there. That's okay, that's not a difficult fix. We can still render a good edge to this cloud. Let's have this kind of connect to there, and then down to here. And you can see we're creating a line, a shelf. This is how we're going to make this the way we really want. We'll also put a little bit of a bend on it so it isn't a straight line. It'll look a lot more natural in just a second. Just bear with me. I do have an idea. Sometimes, before I commit to applying a lot of paint, I kind of sketch out my idea. This will be the brightest area, and then we'll launch into there. Yeah. Okay. I know you're getting a lot of we'll say personality out of this lesson here. It's kind of thrilling at this point. I feel like it's an exploratory piece. It's one where you kind of learn as you go. You get ideas as you go. Generally, when I work on the smaller pieces, I kind of plan it out from the beginning, and I know kind of exactly what we're doing through each portion of it. But with this, it's just so massive that you're kind of continuously discovering things, and therefore it's continuously exciting, but also makes you ask questions and figure things out on the spot. So it is, I think, more of a cathartic process, more of a exploratory process, and therefore a process that kind of invokes more of a reaction. So hopefully you just find some humor in it. But what I kind of figured out there was that this does look like it's farther away. Like that swoop in the background, this looks like it's protruding, it's forward, this is extra depth. This is fantastic. This is what I want. It'll take a little bit of crafting to make it make as much sense as I want it to, but we can definitely get it there. Now here I am running a little bit of the highlight back, and this is going to make it very visible, very notable, that this cloud now has a second portion. See that? So this is a shelf, it's come out, there's the top, it leans back, oh, and then it extends out again, and then maybe that connects into there. If we just kind of extend this a little bit, we'll need more of the actual purple, or whatever we used there. At this point it's a very ambiguous color. But that's great. And then I can do a little bit of a blend to underneath, just for a couple of different portions. And some of the tips of these at the back can receive a lot of light, but not all of them. We talked about if we wanted to make it very stark one way or the other. It wasn't one way or the other, it was both. Again, really deviating from the reference photo. This is much more complicated than what the reference photo had, but when you have such a big canvas, you have so much opportunity. Didn't want to waste it. Essentially doing a bit of a line there to imply that this is casting a shadow back here. And that means that this is going to catch more light, but I'm not going to do too much light because it is on the edge and I don't want the eye getting too distracted. I will brighten it a little bit, but I want to step farther away from the canvas to kind of assess how bright I can make it in relation to everything else. But while we're here, right up close, working with the details, I'm going to use some very fine paint. My brush is pretty damp right now. And I will just help this detail right here. There we go. Okay, let's take a couple of steps back, assess what we've managed to accomplish here, and what we need to do going forward. So, as we step back, as you can tell, this area still doesn't have the highlights of those, which makes sense. We did go into it with a slightly darker variant so that we had the opportunity to build, and now that we're farther away and we're not kind of zoomed in on the area, we can establish those real highlights like what that has, but to a lesser extent because I really don't want to pull the eye too close over there. So I've mixed up a pigment. I'm going to test it over in a couple areas here. It's quite saturated. I think it's actually more saturated than what we used before, but it's a very similar value. So I think we'll take some of it, move it over there. I'm going to add a hint of Mars Black, not because I want to darken it, but because I do want to desaturate it, and when I add more white, it will mix with that black, it'll make it more of a gray. Yeah, that was the right call. Important to recognize that you can use black not as a darkening mechanism, but as a desaturating tool. So here we're adding on that highlight like we did with those. Working it on the left-hand side, of course. I still have quite a bit of pigment on my brush, which is why I haven't started blending backwards yet. Remember, if anything gets too bright, that's okay. It's pretty easy to make things darker. And I still have pigment on my brush, so I'm actually going to take that off in some water and just wipe off the excess. Now, with just a damp brush, we can very simply take the backs of all of that new bright pigment and blend it back. Try not to hinder that soft line you rendered though. We're getting closer. Starting to work. I'm grabbing a little bit more paint here because what I had on the canvas is now drying. And I want something I can move around. Very good. Okay, so now you see that this, and this, different forms, each and every one of them, which is just what we wanted. I'm also going to grab a little bit of pink, work that kind of in between the shadow areas and the more gold pigment, because this did end up being as a whole more yellowy gold than the rest of it. It's not really an issue. Again, the idea is that the light is more of that than a pink, but at the same time, I do want it to be nice and cohesive, so that's why we are just finding ways to incorporate little bits of that pink, that warmth, work that back in there. And I think this may take a couple of layers still of highlighting and just fixing up. But that's definitely the form we want. This could also use slight highlights in the back there too. I'm going to take 5-6 steps back. Continue assessing, re-evaluating. Good. Let's go back in with those highlights. And this is where it starts to come together. Let me get you a little bit closer now that you've seen what it looks like from far away and kind of how we've been trying to balance it and how I'm going to kind of finish off some of the detail in there. So now we'll grab some yellow, red, titanium white, and I think we're going to try to make this less saturated than what we currently have. If I have one issue with our current color there, it's that I think it is slightly more saturated than the rest of the painting, so I am going to be touching it up with some Mars Black in the smallest, and I mean the absolute smallest amount of Cerulean Blue as well. And there we go. That's definitely more muted. That's what we wanted to find. So, we're going back to those edges. And we need to go back to the edges again because we did interject that pink just a second ago. And while the pink is really beautiful, it is, there we go, taking away from the highlights, working on top of them physically. I'm trying to kind of combine these two areas right here because we had this line, this line, and this line, and it was becoming a little bit too repetitive shape-wise. And generally when that happens, you either need to divide more or you need to combine more. Here I'm throwing an extra shape in there to further diversify. And I think we can throw another smaller cloud in between. This time I want slightly more red. Yeah, it can be like this a little bit later on. We'll add some pink into this. There we go. You probably noticed that I've now gone over these edges 4 or 5 times with different colors, slightly different. And I'd really advise that you do the same thing. This is how we get to what we want. Not being afraid of messing something up that we like, not kind of just accepting what we have, but working to make things better every step of the way. And I think it's very close to being what I want. Taking out some of the contrast, as you can see. Really glowing at this point. Again, in the reference photo, this wasn't bright at all. It was quite dark. But I think this is more interesting.
So here we go, stepping back yet again, and I think at this point I am actually very happy with the sky, the amount of detail, how it's balanced, the movement, and I think we are actually ready to move on in the piece. So with that said, I think I'm going to call it for today. I know the video is probably going to be between 2 to 3 hours, but I think I've been probably painting for about 8 hours today on top of what we did yesterday, but I'm really happy with this. I think this is going to turn out to be an incredible first painting for 2020. And again, it's definitely an exciting one. It's one that's going to take quite a lot of time. You're going to have to do a lot of layering. But I think throughout that process, you'll consistently find pieces that just really energize you, that really get you excited, where you say, wow, look, I did that. And that's such a fun thing. So I really hope you enjoy the lesson. I really hope that you're having fun actually painting it. And hey, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message. I've actually decided to, I believe, make this a Patreon exclusive lesson slash series. You can tell I've been talking all day. But I think I'm going to make this first series again, the All the Real Time videos, Patreon exclusive, just as a thank you to you at the start of the year for letting me start 2020 as a full-time artist who gets to teach painting and just do this sort of thing. Thank you for making this happen. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for, just being here. And yeah, I have so much fun painting these. And I love that you voted for this. Thank you to everybody who showed up in the poll to vote and make this lesson what we're doing. So I had so much fun. I will see you, I believe, next week with part 2, where we are going to do one more cloud as a refresher. And I purposefully left one out because I think it's so important to revisit subjects like that after you've learned them, maybe 1 week down the line. That way you are continuously going back to those ideas, and that way you do retain those ideas. But with that, from there, we are going to start working on some of the mountains, specifically at the back, probably up until here. It is going to be very extensive. If you have ever struggled with rocks, I think that by the end of this painting, you are going to have a very good understanding of them, and I think you'll have a lot of fun making them too. So, again, big thank you for being here. Big thank you for letting us start 2020 like this. I hope you feel like you picked up a lot of information, that you're also very excited about this. But I'm really looking forward to continuing. Thank you for stopping by. I will see you very soon with part 2 of this great big lesson. And as per usual, as always, stay creative.